Hello gamers, it's time to visit an old friend, the Missions tab. We're going to be doing Hornet's Nest today. Not as big of a battle as something like the Last Hurrah, but both sides do have a moderately sized fleet, with it mostly being a high-tech versus low-tech battle. Now I know herons are technically midline, but let's be realistic about this. They feel a lot more like a high-tech ship, with their mostly energy mounts, high top speed. It feels a lot like a high-tech ship. It's an honorary high-tech ship. Now, the enemy does have a significant advantage in terms of both numbers and deployment points. So I'm going to show you how to squeeze as much value as you can out of the ships that they give you to try and pull off a flawless victory. Now, the linchpin to both fleets is the cruiser. So I've talked about this a little bit, but there's the general idea of three primary roles in a fleet. There's swarmer ships, or you might say like frigates and stuff, that they're just able to get around the battlefield very quickly, and they have lower deployment costs, so they can easily outmaneuver and surround enemies. Then you have a fleet anchor, which would be something like ideally a battleship, but depending on how early in the game you are, it can be something like a cruiser or even a destroyer. Like at the very beginning of the game, you could use an enforcer as a fleet anchor, and the idea there is it's slower than everything else, but it has a lot more staking power. It's got that durability. It can stand its ground. And then the third thing would be ships that punch down. So something like the Aurora would fit in there pretty well, as well as a lot of battle cruisers, where something like the Odyssey is not very good at going toe-to-toe with a fleet anchor, like the Onslaught, but it can very easily hunt down smaller destroyers and cruisers, and then use its superior firepower to obliterate them, cleaning up all of the support ships before, which then makes it easier to surround and isolate the enemy fleet anchor. So you've kind of got this rock, paper, scissors kind of triangle. And here, you can see that both fleets have their fleet anchor. For the low-tech fleet, that's the Dominator, and for this fleet, it's the apogee, which is a bit unusual for a high-tech ship to beat a fleet anchor, but in this case, the apogee is relatively slow for a high-tech ship. So it almost, some people say it's not even really a high-tech ship, but I would disagree. I think speed isn't really the defining factor for high-tech. Again, you look at something like the Heron, which I called an honorary high-tech, but really the defining factor is pure energy mounts, with supported by missile mounts, with a complete lack of ballistic mounts, as well as relying on shields rather than armor or hull. So yes, it's got that durability, but that durability comes from its shields rather than a low-tech ship relying on its armor. So, between the weapons and the shields, it's still a high-tech ship, even though it is a bit slower. It's just filling that sort of fleet anchoring role. Now, what you want to do with this thing is you're going to want to stack up a bunch of hull mods, because we're going to need missile racks. Targeting unit is pretty obvious for pretty much every cruiser. Now, it's already got 12,000 baseline capacity, which is pretty insane for a cruiser. That's even more than the Eagle, and the Eagle's numbers are already pretty juiced up. So you can easily grab hardened shields right away, and that's going to be a good pick. ECCM to make our missiles more accurate. And you'll notice one of the things it does have is it's got a lot of dissipation, but that comes with a high shield flux. So stabilized shield is almost always worth it, because that's 9 points to cut this down by 210. That's a pretty good ratio. And lastly, I do want some advanced optics in there, and the reason for that is because a lot of the time the best way to build an apogee is to max out that range. So we're going to go with, you can go with a high intensity laser, although I think, personally, I favor the Tachyon Lance here. And this is basically what you want to do. Now, once you start getting S-mods and you start building these into the ship, then you can add in other weapons, like maybe a graviton here, some more missiles there. In fact, I might grab some missiles as it is. Although a lot of them are not going to be super useful anyways, so I'll just get more capacitors. And so this is the idea. It's going to sit at this gives it weapon ranges that can compete with ballistic ships. Because if you try to go with auto pulse laser here, and like a Locust here, that gives it a range that can compete with, say, a low-tech destroyer, but against the Dominator, then it has a significant range disadvantage, and it's not that much faster. Both of them are pretty, the Dominator is really slow even for a cruiser, but This is pretty average for a cruiser. If this was up against like an Eradicator, which is also low tech, the Eradicator would both outrange and outrun it if you tried to use more regular weapons like an autopulse laser. So pretty much, if you want to use the apogee effectively most of the time, you've got to get one of these two beam weapons up here with advanced optics to give it some solid range that can compete with bigger ships and with ballistic ships. But then the problem is it only deals soft flux damage. So that leaves you with pretty much only the Squall as an option here. None of these other options that you can put it here. I mean, maybe the Locust, but then again, it's only got 1400 range, where the Squall has 2500. So this, a lot of the time, becomes the default option here. So when you're thinking about the apogee, this is how I would start building it most of the time. Now, this isn't super relevant because the apogee is really rare, but I've seen a lot of people say that the apogee is, well, it's a combat freighter, technically speaking, right? It's got decent fuel capacity, decent cargo capacity, and it's got things like high-resolution sensors and surveying equipment. It's meant to be sort of half civilian ship, half combat ship. But I think in practice, it doesn't really lose out much on its combat potential. It can hold up pretty well against other 20 deployment point cruisers. It just gets all of this stuff as a bonus, if you ask me. I mean, the main downside that it's got is that its system is pretty underwhelming. It's just active flares. Now, that does come with the upside that we can skip out on point defense and not really worry about it too much. Even if we've got a combination of good shields plus active flares, so for the most part, missiles are taken care of. The big thing to be worried about would be fighters, which, to be fair, the enemy does have a fair amount of fighters, so that is something to be concerned about. But we're going to move on from that. Now, the enemy having a lot of fighters can be very threatening to our frigates, so we want to be very aware of that. Maxing out capacitors is a good idea, but we can go further than that. Besides just the obvious of maxing out their shield strength, we also want to increase the shield arc. Right? This is something that's pretty important. If you only have 120 degrees, this can be fine for most mid-game battles, just that 120 degree Omni Shield. But when you're up against a lot of fighters, they can attack from all angles, whereas if it's trying to fight like enemy ships, yeah, for the most part it's going to maneuver itself intelligently to try and keep them on the other side of its shield arc. But fighters, it can't really do that, and so it's going to get surrounded and they're going to tear into pieces even if it's got plenty of flux to spare. So going with something like shield conversion, and eventually you would want to S-mod extended shields as well to get full coverage, but at least getting this to increase that coverage makes it a lot less vulnerable to fighters. Now the Tempest, as far as frigates go, is not super vulnerable because it does have its Terminator drones that are very effective against enemy fighters, but this is currently limited by the fact that its termination sequence destroys the drones and they have a 20-second replacement time. Now in the next patch that's getting cut in half, which is awesome. I think that's great. That's a very much needed buff. But as it stands, it can be, that window of vulnerability is a bit long, so it does need some additional defense against fighters. For that, I'm going to grab a Swarmer. This is a good generic option to put on frigates if you don't know what else to put on them, partly because it helps them defend themselves against frigate fighters, and partly just because if this frigate is attacking another frigate, then the Swarmer it's got low damage output, which makes it ineffective against larger targets, but when it's trying to duel another frigate, well, those usually have fairly low armor, so the low hit strength it's not too much of a downside. It's both good against fighters and frigates, and it's got a lot of ammo, so it's a generic option. It's alright. It's alright on frigates. I know the good old Reaper plus missile autoloader is a lot more exciting, but in this case, I would really recommend more of a Swarmer. Which, by the way, as I was saying, there's a lot of fighters in this match, so this isn't like building your fleet here is not going to be like the same way that you would just build it for a generic campaign. Like, as you're going through the campaign, you don't know exactly what you're going to go up against most of the time. You don't know if this fleet is just going to happen to have more carriers. Whereas this being a mission, you can see that ahead of time, and you know that's going to be one of the major threats to your smaller ships. Alright, so from here, I think a pulse laser is a good choice. In fact, let's get more flux, and we can grab something like a graviton beam. I've been surprised because I think this is pretty close. Yeah, this is pretty close to this, where the pulse laser graviton is actually a decent combo. You don't quite have enough flux to support double pulse laser, not to mention the flux from termination sequence. So going with something that's a lot more cheap, like a graviton, is pretty nice. And the graviton, being a beam weapon, is very accurate against fighters, and it pushes them off course. And then plus it helps the pulse laser with the main thing that you're worried about, which is the shield damage. We've already got decent we've got termination sequence for anti-armor, we've got the swarmer for anti-armor. The main thing we need these for is anti-shield. So that's what the pulse laser is here for, and then the graviton helps debuff the enemy shield. And also that soft flux that it puts onto their system makes them less capable offensively. It eats into their flux budget. So graviton's not great, but sometimes it kind of looks like it's not doing anything. It's just that it is actually doing something. It's just that the effect is very subtle. I think it's all right. For the wolves, once again, being frigates, are very concerned with shield durability. And the wolf is largely defined by what you choose to put in these 2 missile mounts and this medium energy. And I think right now a really good choice is the phase lance. It gives it decent anti-armor capability that's also, like compared to a mining blaster, this also has really good anti-armor capability, but the phase lance can also benefit from advanced optics, so it can get significantly more range. And yeah, it does soft flux damage, but the fact that it's energy damage means that it can actually, against other frigates with their lower flux capacity, it can actually force them to drop their shields or overload, whereas the mining blaster is really never going to do that. On top of that, with the flux efficiency at 0.8, it's a pretty, it's affordable, surprisingly affordable for how much armor penetration it offers. Now some other good choices are out there, of course, like an ion pulsar is pretty nice. It's got a good burst damage against shields, and then it's got that EMP. But I think I'm going to go a little safer and pick the phase lance. This is also very good against fighters, and given how many fighters we have to go up against, it seems like it's worth considering. Now, I would normally think about putting sabos in these slots, just to give it some hard flux kinetic damage. But the thing is, a lot of the enemy frigates are hounds. They've got a couple lashers, sure, but there's a lot of hounds and like buffaloes which don't really have any shields. And then the condors themselves, they have shields, but their flux capacity is so low that the phase lance can take care of it by itself. Which means that there's not actually that many ships where they need anything more than the phase lance to get through their shields. So instead, doubling down on the swarmers to get more anti-fighter capability seems like a good choice to me. Alright. In fact, mining lasers, I might want to upgrade these, but triple mining lasers not bad. They do have decent range, especially with advanced optics. They actually have the same range as the phase lance, and then all 3 of them can focus on the target, but if there's fighters coming in, they'll switch over to it. Although, I mean, this would be hypothetically, a great example for where to use the PD lasers. You can see, currently I've got it set up for what it's going to be in the next patch. Only 3 ordnance points and 500 range. But that's the next patch. In the current patch, the PD laser is kind of bad. In fact, in my tier list, I put it at like C tier, but I think in retrospect, it's more of a D tier weapon. There's just so little reason to use it. I think once it gets buffed to this, it's actually going to be, for my tests, it's actually been pretty decent. A few of them you stack up a couple of them, they can pretty reliably shoot down salamanders. They're more, on top of being more affordable. The combination of extra range and low ordnance points makes it a lot more viable, but as it stands in the current patch, it's not that good. Now let's see what else we've got. We are going to want more of this so we can actually afford our weaponry, and then we've got 6 ordnance points left. Look at that. Now with only 180 seconds of peak performance, it might be a good idea to try and squeeze in hardened subsystems. Or I could upgrade this to a burst laser. But then again, I don't actually have any ordnance points left. I could well, look at this monstrosity. It's asymmetrical. Yuck. I think I'm going to run with that. it doesn't quite need both swarmers if it's got a burst laser anyways. So I think this will be fine. Yeah, let's do this. I know. It looks really unbalanced. Like it should constantly be like leaning over to the left because it's got so much more weight over here. But just don't think about it too much. I'm sure it'll be fine. And I'm just going to do the same thing over here. No reason to complicate things by trying to make different builds for these. I mean, in theory, it could be interesting to have different builds for multiple different ships of the same type. The slight problem you run into is that you can easily get confused when commanding your fleet, because then you have to think, oh wait, hold on, which build does this one have? So, especially since you can't really... Oh, well, I guess I can change this. So I could change it from close support. So I could change one of them to say, like, DPS, and I could change one to say, like, anti-armor or something, and have them specialize that way. But then, you know, I'd still have to read after clicking on them, and who wants to read? I want to fight spaceships. Reading, not so much. And then we get to the Medusa. This thing is actually really good. Someone asked what my thoughts on destroyers are, and I'd say like half of them are actually really good. At least for the combat destroyers. Like the Manticore and the Sunder both hold up pretty well as escorts. The Medusa can act as an escort as well, but I don't think it's quite as good as an escort compared to the other two. If you need an escort, Manticore or Sunder is probably going to be a better choice. But what the Sunder can do that they can't is it can act independently, and it doesn't just get killed most of the time. Like if you get an officer with systems expertise, then that phase skimmer is a big deal. It just skips across the battlefield, and whenever it's in danger, it just leaves. It's gone. You know, it puts up a peace sign and fades out of existence. It is out of there. Vamonos. So the Medusa actually, and couple that with actually having one of the strongest shield out of all the destroyers, the Medusa has some really good in survivability, which allows it to operate a lot more independently than the other ones. And that's the half that I consider pretty good. The other half are not as good, but they're okay. You know, they're usable. Now, let's see. Hardened shields, we're going to want at least 10 capacitors here. The reason for that is, if you do the math, hardened shields effectively increases your capacity by 25%, at least in terms of how much damage you can absorb. So if you're under 8,000 for a destroyer, then it's kind of more efficient to add capacitors if you're just purely looking at shield HP. Now I know it's a bit different once you factor in venting, and once you factor in like the reduction of shield piercing arcs. I know it's a little bit different once you factor those things in, but just looking at pure damage absorption, it's more efficient to get capacitors up until you hit 8,000. And then hardened shields is more efficient at that point. So I usually, I'll aim to get at least 8,000 on my destroyers before grabbing this. Which you might as well, because once you grab this, then every capacitor is worth more once you have this. That's the way that works. Increasing your shield efficiency makes each capacitor more valuable. So you might as well. Let's see. Targeting unit. Yeah, I think that's good. Although, advanced optics... I mean, might as well stick to phase lances since I'm already... I mean, I'm tempted to even throw phase lances here, but, you know, alright, now let's not go that far. We'll put phase lances on the ships that have phase skimmers. Right, this has a phase skimmer, so it gets phase lance. This has a phase skimmer, so it gets phase lance. That's what we're going with today. And I just want to move that because I like having them in order. And if you don't put them in order, I will come out of your monitor and punch you in the face. You have to do it this way. There's no other choice. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that the ship only has soft flux damage. But luckily, unlike the Wolf, it's got universal mounts, which means we can get light needlers. What can I say? They've got the best efficiency out of all of the kinetic options. And on top of that, they've got good burst damage, which matches up nicely with the phase lances. They can do very nice hit-and-run tactics where it jumps forward, hits you with the needlers, then hits your armor with the phase lances, and then as soon as you start fighting back, it can jump away. Very annoying and very effective. And then for all these remaining slots, just fill them out with a nice set of mining lasers. Gives it a little more defense against all the fighters that are coming in, and filling out all these slots, at least against enemies that have EMP weapons. They can sort of, like EMP arcs will not target empty slots, so by filling these slots, it helps distract EMP arcs. Now, a low-tech enemy is not going to have a lot of those, but because of all the fighters, it's still probably worth it. At this point, we're going to need some more flux. We're a little overfluxed here, but that's fine. With the Medusa is already very good at hit-and-run tactics, so being able to... Building up a bunch of soft flux is not a big deal because it can just phase skimmer away if it's in any danger and then vent. So being overfluxed here is fine. In fact, that's also kind of fine for these guys. Yeah, they are a little overfluxed, but it's totally fine. And then we get to this thing. This thing might actually be really good. It might be better than the Condor, which sounds weird because the Condor is only one more deployment point and it gets twice as many fighter bays, right? Well, let's think about this for a second. The Condor has only like 45 ordnance points compared to 85 on this thing. So the Condor a lot of the time can't even pick out the fighters it wants because then it just completely runs out of ordnance points. Whereas this thing, you only need one fighter. You get a lot of ordnance points that you can then fit onto these. Like the Condor's got a medium missile as well, but then it's only got small ballistics instead of medium ballistics. It's also got just worse stats across the board. But again, you think, oh, well, it's got 2 fighter bases. It's got to be worth it, right? Reserve deployment. Where the Condor has fast missile racks, this has reserve deployment, which doubles the number of fighters in the wing. Now, this is only temporary, but I'd argue that having 1 fighter bay with reserve deployment is about as good as having 2 fighter bays, even though there is some downtime. And there's a couple reasons for that. The first reason is, let's say that I put Warthogs here. And that's only going to cost me 12 ordnance points, and then that gets boosted up to double the number when it uses reserve deployment. Whereas on a Condor, I have to pay 24 ordnance points to get 2 wings of Warthogs. So from a cost perspective, it's already more efficient, but then there's a little quirk of how fighter wings work. When it activates reserve deployment, it instantly prints out 3 fighters here, because for the Warthogs in this case. And with the way that replacement rate works, it's only going to be losing replacement rate when it's under the maximum number of fighters. If it's at 3, then it's actually recovering replacement rate. And that means that even if the Warthogs get wiped out, and it's losing replacement rate, as soon as it activates reserve deployment, it prints out 3 fresh fighters, and now it instantly starts recovering its replacement rate. So over the course of a battle, having 1 fighter bay with reserve deployment is going to keep a much healthier replacement rate than you would get with 2 fighter bays. And for that reason, 1 fighter coupled with the cheaper ordnance points to cost overall, I think reserve deployment with 1 bay might actually be better, or arguably at least about as good as just having 2 fighter bays. And all of this for only being 1 deployment point cheaper. I think this might just be better than the Condor. I mean, especially if you're actually trying to hit the soft cap for fighter skills, where you only get up to 8 bays. Well, why would you want 4 Condors when you can have 8 of these? Well, aside from the obvious fact that having 8 Geminis would just be annoying, herding them around like cattle. But in theory, this should be really good. The problem is that it's, even if you try to up its defenses, it's still pretty much made of paper. It's not much more defensive than the Condor. And so it's still going to be very vulnerable, which is why I'm not going to bother giving it real weapons. I'm going to give it some flak cannons. I'm going to give it thunders, so it can stay as far away from the battle as possible. And while we're at it, throw in a pylum, so it does not have to get close to the enemy, because it is not going to last very long. And since it's not getting close to the enemy, I don't really need to invest too much in its defenses, and it can instead grab like Nav Relay and ECM to try and squeeze out some fleet-wide bonuses. Throw in a deck crew, throw in ECCM package, and then spend the remaining points in the shield. Alright, that's a Gemini. And then the herons. So what I'm thinking here, since the enemy's low tech, it might be a good idea to just spam warthogs. Right, they've got those light mortars, so they're kind of useless against shields, but if it's up against, say, an enforcer, the enforcer's shield arc does not cover the whole ship. So if it's being surrounded by 3 warthog wings, some of those shots are going to get through. And they're going to do some significant damage, unlike, say, if you try to bring broadswords. Like, the kinetic damage is nice against maybe the Dominator to try and break its frontal shield, but against a lot of the other ships, it's just not doing that much damage, where the warthogs actually will. So for that reason, I'm going to go with that. Now, I am tempted to go with a hypervelocity driver, but the DPS that it's going to provide is pretty limited, and at the same time, it kind of has to risk itself to get closer. When instead, I'd really rather it just sit at 2,000 range for the warthogs. But I guess I might as well. Let's try it. It's not like it's going to... It's not like it's made of tissue paper. It'll be fine. Hardened shield. So I said on destroyers, the point that you want to get up to is about 8,000. For cruisers, it's about 12,000. So for the... let's see. Yeah. Even if you get 30, you don't quite reach 12,000 on a baseline heron. Now, at this point, it might still be worth it, but I only have 6 ordnance points left anyways. And if I'm lower than that, it's probably not going to be worth it. Instead, let's focus on some anti-fighter technology, because the enemy does have a lot of fighters. Let's even get point defense AI. There we go. That's good, right? Fill out the remaining slots with some mining lasers, and then split these just like that. And then just do the same thing over here. And then hopefully, this should prove itself valuable on the battlefield. They've got a lot of Cobras, they've got a lot of Talons. Having some burst lasers with 50% extra missile damage and ignoring flares, and some extra range, should give it some solid defense against all of those fighters. This gives it a little bit of kinetic damage to support the warthogs, and that should be effective against a low-tech enemy. Well, let's get right into it then. Play mission. It seems to be a bug. Sometimes they just show up and they're not fully combat ready. Yeah, I don't know why. They should all be at 70%, but this one's chosen to be at 50%, I guess. Although, as long as it's over 50%, it doesn't actually affect its performance in combat. Between 50 and 70%, there's no difference. All of that counts as neutral. It's just a bit odd. Alright. So we've got 4 capture points. Now, I do like how these are laid out for some of these missions, but it's kind of a shame that you never get these layouts in the actual game. Like, this layout does not exist in the actual game. And there's several other missions that are like that, where it's like, oh, this is a cool layout for the capture points. You're just never going to see it when you're actually playing. So this thing is going to do what I planned for it, which is it's going to sit in the corner and not move. In fact, here's a little tip. Change this over to rally civilian craft, and then tell it to go there. Because with the rally point, it does have a little bit of leeway, and it'll try to engage the enemy as they get closer. If you choose rally civilian craft, it's just going to sit on that point, and it's not going to move. Right? If you really want it to just not move, you've got to use this command instead of the regular rally point command. Don't ask me why. That's just the way it works. I don't have answers for why it works that way. Now for these, there's a big difference between setting them to search and destroy for the carriers or not. Because carriers have at least non-battle carriers, like the Heron, have a default behavior where they sort of automatically escort a nearby ship, or preferably a larger ship. But if you set them to search and destroy, they kind of ignore that behavior and operate more independently. Now in this case, I'm going to try and have them operate a bit more independently. And then our remaining ships, all of these fast, so they're going to go capture the points. And then we've just got to be mindful of what's happening with... Actually, I should also turn on autopilot, because I'm not going to be piloting the flagship. We have to be mindful of what's being targeted by the enemy fighters, and try to make sure that our frigates don't overextend here. Now, it is funny that I'm capturing the points, even though You don't really... Deployment points don't matter here. It's not really a factor, but... Yeah, getting a little extra nav relay is nice. Getting our ships a little faster. See, these hounds, they don't have any shields, so phase lances are going to be pretty painful for them. Like, they're just going to die. So you can see over here, this is where a lot more of the enemy forces are. So do you want to be careful on this side. You can see the light needlers hit first. Yes, the hammerhead. You can see the Medusa with its hardened shields, and it's winning that flux war, but it's a little hesitant to engage, which is fine in this situation because there's a lot of fighters. I don't really want it pushing for a kill. Let's try not to fight over the capture points too much. I'll take those off. Rip. Although, funny enough, the Buffalo Mark II is pretty effective because you can spam it and just spam a ton of missiles. So in the early game, it can be a good ship to just bulk up your forces really fast, assuming that you can find a decent volume of them. But they don't last into the late game, that's for sure. You can see frigates doing what they do best, working together to bully a larger ship. I do love how the AI is firing a squall at a ship that has no shields. It just be like that sometimes. There's nothing you can do to stop it. So you can see the investment in point defense here was for a good reason. Look at all of that. All the bombers coming in. And then its shields block that, but it's not quite enough flux. Well, it does have enough flux. It's just barely enough flux. I said not quite enough. I meant just barely enough. That's what I meant to say. So this thing is retreating after getting bullied. Looks like they killed the Enforcer. Oh, did that pylon actually take out your engines? Oof, that's rough. Oh, did you just fire it at the edge of your range and then while it was backing up? That's a shame. And then you can see here, like if this Dominator tries to fight the Apogee in a direct combat, the Dominator is going to win that fight. It's got better stats. But this is largely why we aim for the long range, is because like we really don't want this thing just having to get really close to the enemy fleet and then losing that direct combat. With this combination, it can engage the enemy from pretty significant range and do some decent damage. Yeah, the combination of frigate plus fighters is pretty decent, right? Because sometimes frigates will be really close to the point where they can engage larger ships, but they just don't quite have enough power to actually pull it off. But then you throw in some fighters to support them, and suddenly they can win that battle. Although it's not really going to kill the Dominator in this situation, but it is at least chipping away at it. Yes, kill him. In fact, I'll give you a direct order. Kill him. Oh, you know what? You're probably struggling because you've run out of sabos. Ah, but look. The Thunders. Actually, what I really should be doing is getting my Medusa and ordering it to kill some of these Condors. Because a large part of the enemy fleet's power here comes from these Condors. Oh, you did actually manage to kill it. Nice. Good job. I should get you to come over here and support that. Now, ideally, if you've got Condors like this, you don't want to be... like, the AI obviously is not great at managing its fleet, but you really do not want your Condors wandering around independently like this. And if you see the AI doing this, you can send... This is a great example of why you might want some frigates in your fleet. Because you can just send them to target down vulnerable ships like this. Well, Reddit, you can do that too. Just kill all of them. Kill them dead. Yeah, okay, maybe cool it a little bit. You know, we don't want you dying. Ideally, I would keep you alive. Warthog's getting mixed up with enemy Talons here. They've still got a Lasher. Let's see how long that lasts. Yeah, now that we've cleaned up all of these stragglers, there's not a whole lot left to their fleet, and we can just surround and take them out. Oh wow, you actually managed to kill the Hammerhead. Nice. I mean, you do have support from the Warthogs, but still. That's a 10 deployment point destroyer versus the current version of the Tempest, not even the buffed version that we're getting next patch. You seem to be chasing after some fighters that have already left the map. So you should stop doing that and instead do something useful. I think you can start going after this, actually. And so we can have all of you guys work on that. Yeah, this is not good for the Dominator. Chasing after the fastest ship in the game when you're the slowest cruiser in the game is not a good idea. They still have this Lasher over here, but I don't really think it matters. Yeah, because it's also got in range of this Gemini just sitting at the edge of the map, and now it's gonna get harassed by those. I mean, this is basically how we drew it up. Some Wolfpack tactics here. The enemy fleet is defeated, even though they still got their fleet anchor here. We just went around it and ignored it. And now, there's nothing left to defend it, so we can just overwhelm it with our superior numbers. Yeah, the Lasher died to that. The Enforcer died to all of those guys, and now we just clean this up. You know, it's also nice that on the Heron, the increased damage from its system, you can see when they're lit up all red, does give them increased hit strength, so they can actually bite into heavier armor, which is pretty unusual for fighters. You can see we've basically got everything. A couple of their ships managed to retreat, but that was a nice clean victory. So yeah, for now, that's about it. See ya.